Welcome to another episode of Keeping It Realty with Marc and Brian. Before we get started, big shout out to East Brother Beer Company for being the show's sponsor. And today we're drinking their Pilsner.
Yes, and we've had this before, and it's great the second and third time around.
Second, third, fourth, fifth time around?
I've lost count.
Yeah, so have I. Okay, we're going to jump right into it. We've got a great show for you guys. And very first topic is the CCAR meetings, or the California Association of Realtors meetings. So,
and for those of you who don't know, Marc actually participates in Legislation Week with California Association of Realtors. So he is really at the cutting edge of all the latest laws that are coming downwind, from like housing to rent control, to all of these different things that we talk about on the show. Marc, and I'm going to leave this up to you because you were going to give us all the latest and greatest stuff that's coming downwind.
Yeah, so there's a lot that I cannot talk about because a lot of the stuff is behind closed doors. However, I do want to talk
about it, but he'd have to kill us.
I do want to talk about a lot of the upcoming bills that have recently passed committee, and they're going to the actual California Legislature, Assembly, and Senate floor. These bills are going to go to the floor for discussion, possibly revisions, and the idea is for politicians in California to vote on these by September. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, and you'll see why. Very first bill that we're going to discuss is Assembly Bill 1482, which would impose a statewide rent cap. This is essentially rent control statewide for cities that do not already have a rent control policy or ordinance in place. Now, you've probably heard about Oregon recently passing a 7% cap rent control ordinance throughout the entire state. Well, California now is piggybacking off of that, and that's literally what they're looking to do. Now, this bill would be a 5% plus CPI. Now, there are people, even politicians on the Democratic side, that say 5% plus CPI is not too high enough to be reasonable. So there is going to be a big discussion on this. They're thinking about possibly matching up Oregon's at 7%, possibly even 10%. 10% plus CPI. So there's going to be a lot of discussion in the coming months. So you definitely want to look for that. Assembly Bill 1697 and Assembly Bill 1481 would essentially impose just cause evictions throughout the state of California. Now, this is a whole nother episode in itself, but there's a lot of issues that come with just cause evictions. The whole idea behind it has a lot of good meaning. Obviously, why should you get evicted if you haven't done anything wrong at the property? But you can get evicted if the owner needs to move back in, if they're going to sell the property, if you're breaking the lease agreement, if you're not paying rent. So it makes sense to have just cause eviction, but there's a lot of intricate details that cause a lot of real world problems and legal fees to really go up when it's really unnecessary. So that's a bill that's going to be up for discussion. Assembly Bill 36 is Costa-Hawkins modification. So for many of you that were following Prop 10 just this last election cycle during the midterms, there was a bill to repeal Costa-Hawkins entirely. Well, that bill basically failed, so Costa-Hawkins stays in effect. Costa-Hawkins, what that essentially does is it exempts single-family homes and condos and townhomes from rent control inside cities that have rent control. It also allows for vacancy decontrol within rent control ordinances. And so it's really important, really, from the vacancy decontrol. So if you have a rent control tenant that leaves, you as a landlord can then take that up to market. Well, there's now a modification being proposed to this where they would actually modify this to where it would place rent control on single family homes and would only exempt real people, real persons, not LLCs and not trusts, which would be very interesting on this. Section 8 recently just made a pass, and this really wasn't a big law change. It didn't have to be voted on or anything. It was basically regulatory from HUD, and HUD controls Section 8 and various housing agencies. And historically, they give you about 120-day notice that they're going to come in and inspect buildings. The problem with that is 120 days is a long time, right? That's 3 months. And what happens is they provide notice to a landlord. Landlord then takes their time to get the repairs done, but they have 120 days. They do the repairs to get a clean inspection. And what typically happens is there are some landlords that do not keep up their units very well. And because of that, HUD decided we want to enforce this a lot stricter, and instead they're moving from 120-day notice down to 14-day notices. This is causing a big stir amongst a lot of landlords because they're like, well, 14 days sometimes is not enough time to actually get ready for an inspection for a wide range of different reasons. So it's going to be interesting to see if HUD actually goes back to 120 days, or they come up with a compromise, maybe something like 30 days. Now, just a couple of things I do want to mention because we hit the bell, but these are two other important things. There is Senate Bill 521, where they're looking to give landlords a tax credit for renting out to Section 8 tenants. So basically,
that'd be amazing.
It would be. Sorry about that.
Technical difficulties.
Yeah, it makes it fun. Makes the show fun. So if you rent out to Section 8, then you could possibly get a tax credit. So I think that's a great bill. There's a lot of support for that, and I think
I would support that.
Yeah, a lot of politicians are supporting this. And then the final one I want to discuss is Assembly Bill 1110, and this is rent increase notice requirements. So right now, according to law, and this is outside of rent control cities, if you're going to raise rent and the rent increase is less than 10% in any 12-month period, then you get to give a 30-day minimum notice. If it's more than 10%, it's a 60-day notice. Well, now they're looking at changing this to a 60-day notice for under 10% and a 90-day notice if over 10%. So this is something that we're going to be watching. It seems like politicians are 50-50 on this, but we'll see. So
I mean, it's still tolerable. It gives you as a responsible landlord enough time to still be able to roll with the punch and accommodate all of the expenses and still keep the building afloat.
Yeah, I don't see it as a big problem because it comes down to planning.
Right.
If you're rushing at the last minute to do rent increases, well, that's just poor planning. If you don't have enough time to do it, hire a property management company.
Just quick takeaway from that is that as all these laws are coming down, especially with rent control and all these various new things coming into play, is that rent control eventually will pass. It's a matter of making sure your projections on your buildings and everything are in line with that, so that your expectations are correct and that you budgeted things correctly. And also, more laws are coming down. So becoming a landlord is becoming more and more a game that you need to take care of with all the legal components in place and all the professionals that are looking out for you. It's no longer just a part-time thing that you can kind of do on the side without being potentially out of compliance.
Yeah. Okay, so the next topic we want to talk about is the Fed rate, and is the Fed going to cut rates or are they going to increase rates? We saw them increase toward the end of 2018. We saw the devastating effects from that. We saw a big slowdown in many different sectors, many corporations. One of the big problems is that corporations cannot afford the increase in interest rates and short-term rate because of the debt that they owe. So
just to put things in perspective, when they cut this particular Fed rate, it doesn't just affect the housing market with respect to interest rates on mortgages. It also affects employers. Many of them are relying on lines of credit to make the payroll because of accounts receivables coming in. So the manufacturing industry that employs many individuals, or the retail industry, are all going to be affected by these increases or decreases in the Fed rate. And of course, if a company can't afford to make payroll, then it's going to lay off hundreds, potentially thousands of employees.
And the one big scary thing in the tech sector is a lot of the different zombie companies, where as little changes to the simple short-term rate increases so much in interest payments on their debt that they owe, that it just causes a lot of problems. If we have a recession and a lot of these zombie companies, the reason why they're called zombie companies is because their income, their revenue does not cover expenses. And if they can't raise capital, Well, guess what? They're going to have to do massive layoffs to bring the numbers to balance them out, or they simply just go out of business. And that's the scary part about the next recession, is that you might see a lot of job losses instead of a housing market crash like many people are thinking. But a lot of people say, okay, well, the Fed, are they going to raise rates? No, they've already announced they're not going to raise rates. We've seen the damage done with just just a little bit of increases. But how does this affect the actual long-term 30-year mortgage? Because we saw the 30-year mortgage drop yesterday.
Right. Well, again, when the 30-year mortgage drops, it of course makes the cost of borrowing money cheaper. It allows more people to buy homes. The people who are employed by large employers, they're able to keep their job and afford the mortgage payments, right? So,
and one thing that you also mentioned to me a while back, and you pointed this out to me about a year or two ago, is that the long-term rate also tends to follow the stock market. And if you notice what's happened with the stock market this week, we've had a lot of turmoil. We've had the stock market drop a bit because of the whole China-U.S. trade war, where they're trying to. Trump basically gave an ultimatum on Twitter, of all places, and there's a lot of uncertainty going on. And now they have a deadline for Friday to really come up with some kind of trade agreement. And so, because of that turmoil, you see the stock market drop. Yeah. And coincidentally, the 30-year mortgage rate dropped.
Correct. Well, you got to remember too, with the trade war in China, that most of the companies that are actually affected there are going to be American companies that have decided to manufacture products abroad because of the better job wages or the lower cost of job wages from a manufacturer standpoint, which are in turn imported back to the United States. So these additional tariffs are causing it to be more expensive to import certain products that are traditionally American companies like GE that manufactures a lot of their things in China. And so all of these different things are kind of, we're now in an environment where, even though we might be separate countries, we're all extremely intertwined, at least with respect to China, where if whatever affects us here is affecting China in some way, and vice versa. And so all of these different things right now with the trade wars are also causing this turmoil that you've described, that's affecting the stock market and also affecting the economy, to the extent where the Feds, they realize if they increase the Fed rate, which they should do, will essentially turn us into another recessionary period. So of course they can't do that. So there's a bit of a gridlock going on.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see what's going on between China and the U.S. And a lot of this trade war issue going on is really because China has caught up to the U.S. in the market share of the global economy.
Correct.
In fact, I've got a great chart here, and I can't really show it to you right now, but we'll show it later. But basically, it covers a 1,000-year view of the global economy and basically the powerhouse countries. And you had India and China 1,000 years ago as the powerhouses of the world economy. Mm-hmm. However, that greatly changed, and then it quickly became Europe, and it became the U.S. However, China's caught back up, and now there's a big battle between the two in order to stay as a number one superpower, because, as you know, when you're at the top, that's when you get the investments, that's when your economy grows, and that's when your people become prosperous. So it's crucial for the U.S. to stay on top, but it's becoming harder because, again, we're intertwined. It's a global economy, and it's not as simple now as just adding tariffs.
Right. No, absolutely not.
Okay, so next topic, we want to talk about the new modes of competition. So it's very interesting. RE/MAX CEO David Linger made a statement to Zillow and Trulia, and basically, and I'm going to quote him right now, "We can be partners today, but if you ever cross the line over into our side of the world, we are enemies."
Oh, wow. That's a
shots fired.
Yeah, shots fired.
Shots fired. And
it's like Game of Thrones in real estate.
It is. That should be a TV show, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, this is a little off topic, but did you notice that there was a Starbucks cup inside the latest Game of Thrones show?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, someone left the Starbucks cup sitting on the table.
Irish coffee shop, not Starbucks.
Really?
Oh, really?
Interesting.
Let's shoot in Ireland, so.
Are you sure it wasn't Starbucks?
It wasn't Starbucks.
Okay.
Just looked like it.
It looked like a Starbucks cup. So going back, so there's a big debate, right? There's a big battle really going on in the real estate industry. You have real estate brokerages that do not want companies like Zillow or Trulia to jump into the real estate brokerage world. But you're seeing more and more Zillow, they purchase a home lending company, and they're hinting, and they've been actually hinting at this for years, of starting their own brokerage, right? And then you have companies like Compass Real Estate that are real estate brokerages, but then want to get on the tech side. In fact, there's an issue right now with several Zillow executives switching over to Compass and downloading and taking some intellectual property, and basically Zillow saying, if you try to do anything with this, we're going to sue the hell out of you.
And to put this in really layman terms, but essentially what's happening is that traditionally tech companies that would create services that would service the real estate industry, like electronic MLS or electronic lock boxes, all these various technologies that are employed in selling real estate, these companies have become very prosperous, as they should be, servicing realtors who pay fees for these various services that help them sell houses, apartment buildings, office buildings, leasing space. And now these companies, having amassed a lot of great wealth from the technology they've driven, they're essentially hiring realtors so they can begin to take over the job of just showing properties, selling properties, and essentially cut out realtors in the process, right? Or at least the traditional real estate companies that we've come to know, such as RE/MAX or Century 21. These companies that serviced them before are now beginning to infringe in their space. And so now the shots have been fired. RE/MAX says, you do that, we're enemies.
Yeah, and I mean, what it comes down to is, again, going back to the whole global economy thing. Global economy, there's going to be a lot of competitions. These large publicly traded, even privately held companies are always going to look for what's the next avenue, what's the next way we can grow. Once you've kind of maxed out your market share potential in a certain industry or in a certain way within an industry, you're going to naturally look at other avenues in order to make money, which might compete with your own customers. And that's natural progress. We live in a capitalistic economy for the most part globally too, that, hey, you're going to have competition. And if you can't keep up with the competition, if the next guy is becoming better and innovating better than you, coming out with better products, consumers will have the ultimate say because they're going to use those products and services.
Yeah, in fact, I don't really see why it's a problem. However, like being in the industry so long, I remember there was a time when there was a lot of resistance from realtors just sharing MLS information, right? Like what's for sale or what's been sold and what's currently pending, which usually used to be consolidated into a little MLS book that was turned out every 2 weeks, little paper black and white book, whereas now that information is distributed evenly. And so again, the big fear of that is that as these industries change, that the real estate industry falls to the wayside, very similar to the travel industry, where before you would go to a travel agent, buy plane tickets. Now you can do it on your phone from these services that can negotiate the best rates with all the airlines. And so essentially that's what's coming downwind or attempting to begin to merge or change or have the real estate industry evolve into. Now, there's aspects of real estate where I think it's still going to be too complicated to be able to do that with, but with enough time and enough technology, that could also fall by the wayside. No particular business has the right to stay in a monopoly forever. I mean, you see newspapers are now dinosaurs and they're beginning to go away. Even myself as a real estate entrepreneur, when I got into sales and opened up a real estate office, eventually I merged into doing home loans and then commercial loans. And I vertically began to integrate my own business to incorporate development, owning and operating my own apartment buildings, office buildings, retail space. And all of this is just because you start to see that, as competition grows, you kind of have to, as an entrepreneur or business person, insulate yourself. Well, that's what's happening here. You see the same thing, people just beginning to cross-pollinate, or not even cross-pollinate because they're not complementary, but actually cross over into other people's business. People don't like it, but nothing has really changed. People have been bitching about this kind of stuff for years and years.
Yeah. Okay. Next one is a hot topic, big debate among so many people. Bay Area life is changing, and there's a lot of discussions, political battles, protests, things going on, not just in the Bay Area, but also California and many other parts of the nation. But we're essentially experiencing a housing crisis, right? And you guys have, if you've watched several of these episodes, you've heard about us talking about the solution to the housing market. So we're going to jump a little bit deeper into this and kind of explain to people a little bit more in detail why we believe some of the things we believe. But the one thing I do want to point out, and I get this question all the time, why is Bay Area pricing so expensive, right? And it's because you have little supply and very high demand. But why is the demand so high? I'll tell you right now. Did you know in 2019, January and February, the Bay Area created 81% of the jobs in California?
Oh, I didn't realize it was that high, 81%.
Shockingly high. 81% of the jobs were created in the Bay Area of the overall jobs in California. In March, it was 48% of the jobs. Wow. So when you have that kind of, I'm curious to see what April comes out to, but when you have that kind of data, when you have that level of job creation in the Bay Area, guess what? People are naturally going to come to the Bay Area to take those jobs. Now, if you look at Bay Area domestic migration, the funny thing though is you see people moving out. People domestically are moving out of the Bay Area. So who's taking all these extra jobs? And it's people moving in from different countries.
Different countries, different states.
Yeah, well, no, not from different states, because domestic migration is on the negative.
We've been importing
so it's foreign.
plumbers and electricians from other states to work in our construction industry, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people don't understand that between Silicon Valley and San Francisco, two giant global hubs that are so close together, you're going to have a lot of foreigners wanting to come here. Right now, the Bay Area is 35% foreign-born people.
I mean, it's really more than that. I mean, in a nutshell, it's an amazing place to live, right? I own properties in various different states, large apartment buildings, and so I've had the opportunity to see what it's like in other states. You know, it's cool, but I mean, the Bay Area does have something unique, right down from the weather, the cheese, the milk. But really, the weather plays a big component. It's a pleasant place to physically live, great views of the water, and it happens to be a great place for intellectual hub and employment hub. Like many, as Marc pointed out very eloquently, there's a ton of jobs here, and more job opportunities do come in and grow, right?
And people take up those jobs.
They do.
I mean, on a national level, we're at a 3.6% unemployment
Right,
rate,
no,
the lowest in 49 years.
That really shocked me. Yeah, I had to actually. I was watching the news, and Marc pointed out that the national unemployment rate is 3.6. Now, to put things in perspective,
but San Francisco, 2.2%.
Right. So whenever you're at 4% unemployment rate, that means most of the people are working, and that's the little 4% are usually people who are unable to work or are in between jobs. Whenever you go below that number, what happens is employers are looking for employees, which is why, like, for example, if you go to certain places like Facebook campus or Google campus in the Bay Area, and you look at the way that people are working, I was shocked. I was like, it doesn't look like work. I mean, I can't believe, like, they have on-site dental, they got on-site massages, they got on-site oil changes, and it's just, we can go on and on about those working environments. It's a pleasant place to work, right? And those were numbers you traditionally see in the Bay Area, but now it's in the entire country. So that means the majority of the country is working. And as Marc pointed out, when you're below like 2.2 unemployment rate, that means that employers are actively pulling employees out of areas to come to work at their site.
And as employers, you have to offer more money to keep your good employees. And we've noticed, or in fact, just to keep employees, because there's so many jobs.
Right.
And we've noticed every single year, 2 or 3% increase in Bay Area salaries.
Right. And now, again, this is a huge distinguishing factor from zombie companies, which in the CV world they call the Walking Dead. Again, these are companies that are just breaking even. They haven't really popped yet. And so the numbers aren't there. When companies have to bring in jobs, or are actively searching for employees, companies like Facebook or Google or some of the other tech companies here, those companies are so profitable that even after they've exhausted tax credits, not tax write-offs, but actual tax credits, that once they've resolved how much tax they owe, they get to take the tax credit and apply it to that dollar amount, that they have to go out and pay employees to come in, sometimes if nothing more than to capture an employee from another company, pay them so that other competitive company can't have them. Then you realize that those companies are generating so much revenue that they're creating, generating so much revenue that you don't know what to do with your money, that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah. So essentially, people want to live in the Bay Area, and that's why there's just not enough housing, which this is a perfect transition into our final topic and what we want to talk about, and it's NIMBYism. So we're going to switch this up a little bit. We typically do a property analysis here at the end of the show. We are going to switch it up here, and instead of doing that, we're going to talk about a very hot topic right now in the Bay Area that really ties into why properties are so expensive to rent and to buy, and it's NIMBYism.
In fact, now, just for you who don't know what NIMBYism is short for NIMBY, which is an acronym for not in my backyard. Again, this is a term associated to an individual or a group of individuals that will actively stop a specific change, like a development or a new project coming into their town. It could be a grocery store, it could be a plant, it could be a power plant, it could be new housing. Not in my backyard. And that's this group of people or individual or people who will essentially align themselves with a good lawyer and be able to take old laws or certain new laws that were used and designed to protect certain people and kind of twist it where it really hurts other people or the economy as a whole.
Now, NIMBYs, which is what we're going to call them, historically have been property owners, but we're seeing a big wave of even renters jumping into the whole NIMBY bandwagon.
By the time I came into the area, most of the NIMBYs that I encountered are renters, right? And so these are the same individuals who are complaining that housing is old and antiquated and we need more housing, yet they're the same individuals who will come in and stop new housing developments. And they don't own, they simply rent. I mean, I can tell you stories. I encountered one person who, she was a dream therapist, and to get around and persuade her, I literally had to befriend her, take her out to a cup of coffee a couple of times until she actually liked me and then voted for what a project I was working on. But it went to that level of extent because this person prolonged a project or approval of a project I had for a good 6 months until I had to literally sit down with this person and roll up my sleeves and go do the non-traditional route.
Yeah, it's funny. So many people are complaining about expensive rents, expensive housing, yet as soon as a project gets announced, they go and run off to stop it because they're in favor of more housing. They just don't want it in their backyard right next to them. A good example is over there on Ashby BART. They wanted to essentially take that BART station with all the extra parking and essentially build a lot of units around it. In fact, we have SB 50, the Senate Bill 50 right now that if it passes would allow for individuals or developers to build high density housing near high levels or high public transit centers. So if you're near BART, railroad, anything that can capture a lot of public transportation activity, you can then build high density regardless of the zoning laws from the city, and this would allow more developers to build housing. But
now
guess what? No surprise, cities are against it.
Keep in mind the practicality of that law, which is one, California, and actually most places have a housing crisis, right? And so if you build a multi-unit building next to rapid public transportation, it allows you to create workforce housing to house all the people coming into the state for all the great jobs and weather and cheese that we offer, and be able to, without having to buy a car, jump onto a rapid transit, get into work, and come out without having to congest the already congested freeways. So these things would all be extremely beneficial, not only for the city and the property taxes they generate. More people moving in would supply more consumers for retail, more sales tax. All of these things would just improve the city, give the cities more money for fixing streets and other public services, and all in all create a better use of the land rather than just single houses or old antiquated houses that are falling apart.
And not necessarily for new people moving into the Bay Area, but also for the people existing here, already living here. Instead of 4, 5, 6 people bunking up in a 2-bedroom, hey, it'd be nice that maybe there were 3 units available for these 6 people.
And again, the whole idea of this, for example, we're going to talk about and touch on certain homeless housing projects that were designed to take the homeless off the street as part of this, and how this ties into NIMBY.
Well, let's jump into San Jose.
And in fact, before we do that, just to kind of give you a historical background on NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, thanks to our producer, Sam, he pulled up a couple of historical facts that actually bridge some of my own personal knowledge and experience with this stuff. And a lot of the whole trend of NIMBYism started back in 1916, when specific zoning laws as to whether a district would be zoned retail or commercial versus single-family residential or multi-unit residential were put into place. Eventually, these laws, during the time when segregation and prejudice really existed, also were put into place to keep blacks outside of white areas, or to segregate Asian minorities out of white areas. Now, again, with the passing of the Equal Housing Act, or Equal Housing Opportunity Act, a lot of these laws became vestigial. They're still there, but you can't use them anymore. In fact, case in point, the first time I encountered one of these types of laws was when I was selling an apartment building in Richmond. And in Richmond, which has a high minority population, there were actual CC&Rs in place that specifically said no black people or people of color could live in this place. But if not for the new laws that have been put into place to supersede those old laws that were put there to kind of create zoning restrictions and other restrictions in place, then that law would still be in effect. So if one day the Equal Housing Opportunity Act went away, people of color would not be allowed to live in certain parts of Richmond because of old laws that were passed there. And so now, jumping fast forward back into our present day of 2020, let's tackle the housing problem that's now existing in San Jose, what San Jose and Oakland have done to try to fix the housing problem.
Yeah, so San Jose, I mean, no surprise here, when you have very expensive rents, very expensive housing prices, you end up with a very high homeless population. So of course the solution then is, well, let's help out the homeless population. Now it doesn't always tie into the actual expensive housing, because homelessness, there's plenty of studies that show there's a big percentage of them that also have mental health illnesses.
Correct.
Right. So there's a lot that goes on with homelessness. So it's not just tied to the housing market. However, the housing market does play a small factor into it, and the fact that they don't have a place to live. And so one of the ways that have been shown to prove to fix homelessness is to get people the mental health that they need, and also a stable place where they can live to get back on their feet, get a stable job, and get back into society, because many times that's what these people need. People need our help to get them back into society. And so San Jose had a great plan. They've looked at studies done in Portland, in Seattle, and they have policies that work. And so San Jose wanted to take those same policies and put them in place in their city, and essentially build homeless shelters, and not just really shelters, but nice little tiny, kind of like tiny home units.
Yeah, in fact, we just came from touring a modular factory. Modular factory is a new technology of building houses, apartment buildings, office buildings, you name it, in a factory, not prefab, mind you. Modular is completely different from prefab.
And these are 200-300 square foot units that are amazing, brand new, and much cheaper to build.
Yeah, high tech, really pretty.
And much cheaper to build.
Yeah.
And so San Jose put together this plan to build something like, what was it, 80 units? Or
correct.
80 to 90 units, putting in various different locations. However, what happened was the NIMBYs. People complain that there's too many homeless people. Then when the city puts together a plan to fix the homeless crisis, guess what? Now all these people don't want them to place these homeless people in their place. It's like they just want them to round up and ship them to a different city, right, which has been done by so many progressive cities, including San Francisco. San Francisco literally for the Super Bowl took buses of homeless people and dropped them off in Reno, Nevada. How messed up is that?
Yeah,
wow. But that's a whole nother story. So San Jose is trying to come up with a solution. San Jose had a great solution. following and copying a solution that's worked in other cities. And guess what? The NIMBYs basically came in, stopped all these different projects, basically saying, look, we're in full support of homeless people getting shelter, but we don't want it within so many feet of our schools. We don't want it within so many feet of our homes.
And long story short, what was supposed to be 80 housing units went down to how many?
4.
4 to house the homeless. And in fact, I just said earlier, we were touring a modular factory because I'm looking at building some apartment buildings and I'm looking at modular vendors. And in fact, while we were there, completely unrelated to what I was there for, they showed us how Oakland, the city of Oakland, had their own housing project for the homeless. And in fact, the city of Oakland went out to this modular company to retain their services to build like 100 modular homes, this pretty building. And in fact, they've built them all. They're ready to be shipped and put there. If not for, they can't get a permit passed.
And this is the city of Oakland, cannot issue the city of Oakland a permit.
And again, what this is, a big reason why this is probably in place or happening is because people are constantly filing motions, the NIMBYs, through their attorneys that will, delay the process, ask for one more inspection, essentially, stopping progress to solve a very problem that they're complaining about. So whether it's housing the homeless, giving them better abilities to get themselves out of the position they're in, from education to medical, it also stops the progress of being able to build housing. So whether the housing is affordable or luxury, just by the sheer infusion of more available housing, you're going to be able to make it more affordable because you've created more supply. If not for people tweaking or pushing little aspects of the law that'll continue to delay things because of essentially a fear of change. Whether it's a fear of poor people moving in and destroying the neighborhood, or minorities moving in, or people with too much education who make too much money, that's called gentrification, moving in and changing the environment. And these NIMBYs have now, whereas they originally started with the upper class, rich, white people, it's now even people who are renting. And of any race, it's not just whites, it's any race, can come in and basically go, oh, I'm being displaced, this is horrible, it's going to turn, it's making it, I'm unable to live in this specific area, we need to delay this out for a hearing for another year or two.
Or sometimes it's not even just to stop a project, it's the BS that some developers have to deal with, like your example of having to place $150,000 of artwork on a building.
Correct.
Which, guess what? That raises the price of construction. That raises the price of the rental. And if you sell it, same thing. Like it becomes more expensive because of $150,000 of required artwork because the neighbors want to see something beautiful.
Correct. And now, if you put this in perspective, right? You asked, well, we're talking about all these various factors that make it unaffordable and to live in the Bay Area, but at the same time, the Bay Area continues to grow in spite of this. Well, earlier on, I talked about the Equal Housing Opportunity Act, which was a law that was put into place to essentially kind of like put an end to all the noise that was being created whenever minorities would try to move into a specific area. It's not too much dissimilar from the fight going on right now between trying to improve the infrastructures, create more housing, and the fight that people who are trying to put that kind of stuff into place have to undergo every time because of old vestigial laws that are taken advantage of through, savvy attorneys just looking to make fees, being, representing not in my backyard individuals who want to stop the change in the progress.
And don't forget the spineless politicians who they just want to be voted back in. And so they basically pandered to the constituents the NIMBYs that want to keep them in power. And so, look, the solution is pretty simple. We need to build housing units, right? Everything comes down to supply and demand. And if your supply decreases, right, or if demand increases or a combination of those two, you're going to have an increase in prices. So to fix that, you need to either increase the supply or lower the demand. Well, how are we going to lower the demand when the first 2 months of this year, the Bay Area created 81% of the jobs.
Right.
I mean, are you going to go around and start telling companies, hey, you can't hire anyone else, you can't expand anymore? Now you have a much bigger crisis.
And
at
even
that
more
point.
important than that, just making it easier to get past all the Byzantine bureaucracy to get something built, just making that aspect easier, whether you're building affordable housing, luxury housing, retail space, or homeless housing. All of these different things would not only improve old antiquated architecture that's currently there in certain places, improve our infrastructure so that you have better ability to get to and from places and we don't have congested freeways. It would also affect all kinds of other aspects of life, like the medical field. For example, a lot of the homeless, they're a huge burden on the medical field because they're going to commit more crimes many times, or they're going to do more drugs, and all of this ends up impairing their health. Overcrowding our already overcrowded public health services.
What's one of the biggest pieces of advice that medical doctors give to people when they're sick? Stay home from work, stay home, don't go outside, rest up.
Right.
Well, guess what? If you don't have a home, where are you going to rest? Where are you going to recover from?
You will be a vector for a pathogen.
You're literally going to be back in the hospital every single day. And then that increases costs. And
Right.
It's just a no-brainer situation to get homeless people into their own personal shelter, help them get the medical that they need to get back into society. It just produces a much better and healthier society. There's plenty of studies out there that prove that. But it comes down to building supply. And the problem is NIMBYism. We're at a point where people need to just kind of give up a little bit of their selfishness and just understand that we're all in this together. One of the best quotes, we're all still monkeys on a rock flying at 50,000 miles per hour in space. We're literally
we
all
still are.
monkeys on a rock. And so we're all in this together, and it simply comes down to we need to give a little bit to make a better society. And so we need to build more housing for people.
With that, we're going to end our little rant and tirade on NIMBYism.
Yeah. So thanks for watching another episode of Keeping It Realty. Catch us on next week. And thanks for watching.
Thanks for all the feedback.
Yeah. Thank you to East Brother Beer for sponsoring this show. And we'll catch you on the next episode.
Take care.